Hello, my name's Rebecca Ebel. It's December 2nd, 2020. I'm in Contemporary Art Matters office in Columbus, Ohio. We are still in the middle of a pandemic and Columbus is purple. So we are gathering here virtually for this conversation. I'm delighted to host Heather Jones and Dennis Harrington on the occasion of her exhibition, Heather Jones, A Sense of Place, to be presented at the Alice F. and Harris K. Weston Art Gallery in Cincinnati, Ohio. Heather Jones is an artist known for transforming fabric into contemporary works of art. An Ohio native, she studied art history at the University of Cincinnati's College of Design, Art, Architecture, and Planning, earning both a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts. Her studio is in Dayton, Ohio, where she joins us today. And I have been working with Heather for this past 6 to 8 months, which feels like 2-3 years. But it's a pleasure to have you here. Dennis is the executive director of the Weston Art Gallery, the premier visual art space dedicated to local and regional artists in downtown Cincinnati. For more than 20 years, Dennis has led a small but mighty team to present exhibitions in this nonprofit gallery in the Aronoff Art Center for the Arts. His background as an artist with gallery experience gives him a unique ability to connect with the art community and present important exhibitions to the public. It's an honor to have you both here, and I'm going to hand over the mic and allow Dennis for you to lead the conversation.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you again for hosting this and facilitating this today. Sadly, we are in a state of shutdown at the Weston currently. The show that we had planned with Heather was scheduled to open this Saturday, but we have postponed that. Hopefully, my goal is to have, if all goes well, to be up and running again in January, and we'll have some ongoing conversations with Heather and the other two artists that we're going to be showing in conjunction with Heather's show, Carolyn Maslumi and Johnny Coleman. I am broadcasting from the space that Heather is going to be exhibiting in, which we've cleared out the previous Beacon exhibition, a group exhibition that Miles Turner put together for us that was intended to be part of the Photo Focus Biennial here in Cincinnati this year. And we did at least get that first show mounted and up, and we had public attendance for that. And I was very much looking forward to presenting this new work by Heather and the other two artists I've mentioned. But sadly, as Rebecca alluded to in her introductory remarks, we're not doing well with the pandemic in terms of handling it here, and well, not only in Ohio, but throughout the country. So we've taken a step back, taken a pause. Still, I'm hopeful that being in the space where Heather's going to be is a good, maybe sends out good vibes and will get us through this dark period. And we'll get through the end of this very challenging year, 2020, and better days ahead in 2021, we hope. I had the pleasure also, Rebecca alluded to Heather's studio, which is an amazing space. And one of my favorite jobs as a director is to make studio visits and to see artists in their space with the materials they're working with, to see things in progress. Heather's space is particularly wonderful with great light coming in. So I'd like to kind of go back, and I know from listening to some previous interviews, Heather, that you've covered these bases before, but forgive me for going through some of these questions again that you've answered, I think, on numerous occasions. But going back to your time at the UC and the College of DAAP, what was your area of focus there? Because you had mentioned in a previous interview that you have art history background, and I was curious if your focus was on art history then, or was it painting? Because I think you have origins as a painter as well. So maybe begin with that.
I did, yeah. So my time at DAP at UC was art history. I took some studio classes, to go backward in time. When I was in high school, I was really into painting, but I was not necessarily encouraged to follow that as a field of study. I think, as you know, many art kids often are told that, it's not the easiest career path. So I started college actually pre-med, which is an interesting another story in and of itself. But I took art history classes as my electives. So, I needed X amount of hours in humanities for my first major. And so I remember just sitting in these big halls, these auditoriums with 200, 300 students and, one professor on stage in a dark room looking at slides. Back in the day, that's when I was in college, we were looking at slides, not anything digital. So, looking at slides projected, huge on a screen, and just really being enthralled by what I saw. And so I continued to take art history classes and a couple studio classes, but it was really primarily art history because those were easy to sort of fit into my schedule. They weren't big studio classes that were a few hours long. They were typically an hour-long class. So they worked with my major of, again, pre-med. I ended up changing my major, my third year in college, to art history because, well, it was my third year in college. And by that point, I was kind of removed from the studio myself and focusing on learning about other people's work. And I felt like I don't like being the center of attention. That's just not me. So for me, it was easier to learn about other people's work than put myself out there. So that's why I gravitated to art history. I finished up my bachelor's degree there. I worked closely with Jonathan Rees, who was that professor on the stage who I loved. And really, if it weren't for him, I would not be doing what I'm doing now. So I studied with Jonathan Rees and Teresa Leininger-Miller. My parents both worked at University of Cincinnati. So that meant I had free tuition until I was 25. So, I finished my bachelor's in art history. Took me 5 years. And then I had 2 more years left of free tuition. So I thought, I'm just going to go as far as I can and not have to pay anything. So I remember Professor Rees he was happy that I was there for my master's, but he felt like it probably would have been better if I studied somewhere else just to have more experience with other professors. But he also understood the fact that I wanted to save money. So I worked on my master's there, and that's how I came to be. That's how I met my husband. So, it was a good thing that I stayed where I did.
Were there any particular artists that you were studying during that time, whether it be contemporary?
Yeah, I guess I think everything influences my work, as just an experience in my life. I worked a lot with Professor Rees in my undergraduate degree, and his area of expertise was Italian Renaissance. So I was really, taken about by that era. Pontormo was one of my favorite artists that I studied about with him. But by the time I was working on my master's degree, I was working also at the Cincinnati Art Museum and working on an exhibition that they were in the middle of putting together, a whole renovation of the art museum called the Cincinnati Wing. So I was working a lot with primary resources, going down to the Historical Society, doing research on mostly 19th century artists of Cincinnati. And my thesis, which I have not finished, maybe one day I will, was on a painter in Cincinnati named Thomas Buchanan Reed. And he was a poet and a painter, originally from Pennsylvania, but worked in Cincinnati for a number of years.
When did you transition to actually making work? And did you begin as a painter, or did you initially move into quilt making, or was that something that occurred later?
No, I was a painter. In high school and in college, I dabbled in painting. It was a strong focus of mine in high school. By the time I was in college, it was more when I could find the time. But it was back when I was painting back then, it was representational work. Nothing like I do now. But I was always just making things. I think that is a thread in my life that has been continuous, just making things by hand. When I was pregnant with my first child, I wanted to make things for the baby. And so that's when I started to really make quilts. And so I had always loved quilts and quilt making. So I began to collect them when I was in high school, actually. I had one person in my family who was a quilt maker, and am lucky enough to have a quilt that she made when I was a baby. And then after my children were born, out of necessity, sort of, I turned away from paint and started to work with textiles, because textiles allowed me to have a studio in my house that I could access in little spurts of time that I had. And with fabric, I didn't have to worry about the kids getting into the paint, trying to eat any type of painting materials. So it was really, I was interested in making quilts and things for them, but also it worked in the fact that it allowed me to express creativity, not just for them, but in a more child-friendly manner, I guess.
Well, that's so true with so many artists, where they work with what they have and what they can, and they can be so innovative. in dealing with limitations. I
Right.
think sometimes in the digital world, limitations have been thrown out the door, and sometimes I think it makes it more difficult where everything is possible. And so many artists I've worked with here at the West End over the years have certainly worked in the home environment out of necessity. I think artists are constantly adapting to their environments and their situations, not only their life environment, but their physical spaces they're working in. So, and and I can see that somehow translate into your work too, in terms of patterns you're working with.
Yeah.
But was your earliest quilt making, did it have any similarity to where you are now? Were you working with geometric patterns, or was it something quite different?
Yeah, and I had made my mom, I know I made my mom a quilt when I was in college, I think as a birthday present. And yes, it was more based on a traditional quilt pattern. So there were, geometric shapes, squares, and triangles.
So from there, then when did you start to transition into working with the textiles or fabric and this kind of, I love this phrase you made in an earlier interview that textiles are something like a second skin for us. And we, something we wear from infancy through all our life, we are connected to textiles. And
Yep.
Carolyn Maslumi made a similar statement about her quilts, that our relationship to textiles is a cradle to death experience. But when did you start to experiment with this kind of moving into what you might consider more art quilt form, or the quilt transitioning, kind of blurring the distinction between craft and fine art, although really, of course, all those distinctions have really been blown away, I think, in the past several many years. I'm curious as to when you started transitioning to looking at the textile material as kind of an independent thing, as an object to translate into a different way.
Yeah. In 2015, I wrote a book on quilt making called Quilt Local, Finding Inspiration in the Everyday. And that contained 20 projects that I designed. I wrote instructions so, a reader can copy what I'm doing. And so there was a period of time when all of my book projects were done, the chapters had been written, it had all been edited, but it was waiting to be printed. So there was this lull in the time when the work for the book was done, but the book was not out yet. So it was a lot of work. I have joked that that's like my third child, because it felt like, this huge project that I brought to the world. During that time, before the book had actually been released, I realized that I wanted to paint again. Like, I had been working with fabric and I wanted to get paint out again. And it had been years since I painted regularly. What was fascinating to me, at that point, I'd been working with textiles and making quilts for a number of years, going on 10 years or so. And so I mentioned earlier in our conversation that when I was painting regularly in high school and college, I was working in a representational manner. But I think due to the fact that I've been working with quilts, which are typically, made out of geometric shapes, I wanted to make paintings like I was making quilts. So I was trying to emulate the work that I did in my quilts that I had been producing for the, number of years that I had been working in a painting form. So I tried to experiment with acrylic. I tried oil. I tried gouache. I tried all different types of painting material. And I just wasn't happy with the result. To me, even if it looked similar to what I had done in fabric, that translation that happened as a result of using the paint material just felt like it was lacking something to me. It felt very flat. It felt there was something that was not there. And so after some experimentation, I decided to see what I could do with fabric. And it was at that point where I was trying to figure out how to create something that had the essence of the work that I had done in textiles in the past, but really pushing those textiles to see what else they could become. So I really turned to fabric as a painting material. To me, this fabric has this luminosity. And I just typically use woven cotton, the same kind of fabric that is used typically in quilt making, but there's this luminosity to it that I just could not achieve with traditional painting materials.
And when the earliest development of these pieces, were you initially stretching them over a wood support?
Yeah, there's this whole element of that process, and the technique that I use to create these works is very similar to those. I mean, it's sewing, so it's similar to making a quilt, but then there's that change when, I finish the composition and then I stretch it over a wooden support. And I have an idea of, what it's going to look like before it's stretched, but something happens as a result of working in this manner and with these fabrics, that as the fabrics are pulled taut over that wooden support, some seams shift. And so there's this element of chance or surprise in the work that I can't control. And so it's a little bit of, a surprise to me, how everything looks once it's finished, when they're stretched over those wooden supports.
I think also it creates a sense of tension between the edges. That's interesting, when
Yeah.
you do this. I also, when I visited you in your studio, I got to see some works in progress in the way that you kind of develop these. I think it would be interesting for you to talk about how, whether or not you start with, if you keep a sketchbook or you kind of develop ideas through a sketchbook and then start working with the fabric itself, and exactly how that process kind of from start to finish works.
Yeah, I do work in a sketchbook. I have a sketchbook with me. I try to keep it with me at all times. And I think it's a great place to just lay out some ideas and some, simple early compositions. So I do often work with a sketchbook and typically just pencil. Sometimes I add color with markers. But when I am working in the studio, I've got a design wall. So a wall behind me is covered in flannel. Just like flannel, you might have sheets or a flannel shirt, that same cotton flannel. And the fabric that I use sticks to that flannel. So I can arrange compositions, which is how I work. I, use this flannel wall, place fabrics, different colors, different shapes, different sizes on the design wall, and get a sense of building a composition that way. I might refer to a design I have in a sketchbook. Sometimes I just start working right on the design wall, but I lay out everything, then take it off piece by piece, sew it together using the sewing machine. Construction and craftsmanship is really important to me.
I'm curious then, when you're developing the design for the work from sketchbook to actually starting to cut the fabric and piece it together, sew it, how does scale play? Because in the show that the work that you selected for the West End and in previous exhibitions, you have, fairly intimate pieces, fairly small pieces to very kind of almost monumental scale pieces.
Yeah.
And so is that size kind of predetermined once you get to a certain point? You're gonna be stretching this over a.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on what I'm working on. If I have, a 24-inch panel that I want to work on, I base usually that composition around the fact that I know it's going to be stretched to that size. But also, I think this is true with lots of textile artists. You always have scraps. You always have leftover fabric. So sometimes new works begin their life as cast off from another project. So I love that there's really no waste, or not a lot of waste. I can even take the smallest bits of fabric, sew them together into bigger pieces to sometimes start a new piece that way. But I do like to play with scale. And some of the newer pieces for the show, my studio has, I think they're 16 feet. It's fun to be able to play with these monumental pieces in a space like this, and to just see how far I can push the idea of what fabric can do, how grandiose it can be.
In developing the work for the Weston Art Gallery, all these works are the works that are coming to us newly created.
Yeah, they're all have been made. I think there might be one piece that's maybe from 2019, but no, they were all made in this year, 2020.
And also they've primarily, it's pretty much a black and white show, although there are these more ivory kind of umber shades as well, that if you include it, and focusing primarily, I think, kind of on, geometric forms, generally speaking, and triangles, heavy emphasis on triangles, which I assume a lot of that is inspired by traditional quilt patterns that you've carried forward. But there's also something that you've developed in these works, this layering aspect that you're doing, where you're allowing darker colors underneath or a black to kind of bleed through, so to speak. Or it has this, fabric has this kind of translucent quality that you can read through this in some of these pieces, which I think is an interesting shift that, you know, some pieces read very flat in terms of this geometric pattern where it's very much surface oriented. And in these others, with this more layered feeling, you start to almost see like shadows or histories that are buried beneath the surface. And I think that's an interesting development that you've made in this body of work.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously the work is greatly influenced by traditional quilt making. You know, my family is from Appalachian regions of Ohio and Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky. And so, you know, that history of, you know, women's work with textiles and quilting certainly influences my work. But last year in 2019, I spent the month of October in Dakar, Senegal, which is the west coast of Africa, as a resident in Black Rock, Senegal, which is a new program started by Kehinde Wiley. And I was part of the inaugural class there. The work that I created there was influenced by textile, the traditional textiles, but also contemporary textiles of the western coast of Africa. And so I can see this shift in my work that has happened as a result, I think, of my time there and the work that I did during that residency program. Excuse me, and the new work that has developed since then. You know, this really bold graphic pattern that is in both printed cloth that's used in West Africa, but also woven fabrics that are used there.
And the title of the exhibition you've chosen, A Sense of Place, which, you know, ties to kind of historical connections and family traditions. Like, talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I just you know, hinted at that when I was just speaking about the work in general. But I think place is certainly important in my work. The environment that I was brought up in, the environment that I work in today, my life experiences in different environments, you know, certainly influence my work. And as a native Cincinnatian, you know, I live a little bit north of the city now, but I still consider myself, you know, a Cincinnatian. And so the importance of the city and the region on both me as a person and my work in general, I wanted to reference that with the title of the show.
I noticed too, in some of the works that you've developed for this new exhibition, that there's a sense of movement, and it's an interesting contrast to these overlapping pieces where the kind of shadow play happens and the surface seems to undulate a little bit. But it's an interesting array of movement you get across all these pieces.
Well, I think, I mean, certainly it's intentional. And I think, you know, as you mentioned, I have really been playing a lot with transparency. And that's one way that my work is different than a quilt maker. Because in quilt making, you are told to hide. Like if you were putting two pieces of fabric together and one is light and one is dark, you would always press your seams towards the dark side of the fabric because you don't want that transparency. You don't want that dark fabric, the seams of the dark fabric to show under the light fabric. But I love that. That's one thing that I love about working just with black and white, because you can get these layers of transparency where fabrics are, you know, hidden under each other, or where one fabric stops and another begins. I sort of exploit that in the work. I like to bring that sense of transparency. I mean, because that's what happens when you build up layers of paint, right? So you can add layer upon layer of paint and have areas that sort of come up from behind where, you know, I can't necessarily do that the same way with textiles. So sort of this is my way of, you know, duplicating that sense that happens naturally in painting.
We've talked about scale a little bit in terms of, you know, more intimate scales to really large scale. You've got a couple of works featured, and also in previous exhibitions, I saw the show at, formerly DVAC, the Contemporary, I think it's called now, where you have, where the fabric is not stretched, where it hangs loosely on the wall, which has a completely different kind of feel to it. And I'm just curious how you feel. Part of that's experimentation, of course. I think how one relates to the other, or what you're looking at in these large scale pieces hanging loosely.
Yeah, the large scale pieces started as an experiment, as you said. To me, they relate more closely to quilts. I mean, they're more similar, I think, than my stretched pieces are to quilts in the fact that they can be hung and arranged and moved. I like the chance that it gives me to work larger. It's more manageable to work that way and create a greater scale with those pieces. But those pieces really did come about, again, after my time in Senegal, in Dakar. One thing I would do on my outings was look out the window just as the world went by. And I would notice these clotheslines that would sort of dot the environment. Many people there wash their clothes by hand and then hang them to dry on a laundry line. And again, that's something that also occurs in rural South and other places too, obviously. But that sense of movement that the fabric has in relationship to the environment, and how the fabric starts to interact with the environment and interact with the air as it moves, and the fabric has a tendency to gently sway and move. That's lacking with my stretch pieces. So it's just another way for me to kind of push and see what I can do with fabric and how I can get it to react to the environment. They also feel more sculptural to me. I've been playing a lot with installation and with changing the tautness between of how they're hung. Is it hung closer together? Or I typically hang them with grommets. So I've been playing and experimenting with positioning of the grommets, and are they closer together? Or are they spread apart? And so there's just this sense of, I think, movement and energy that I'm really excited about with those pieces.
And then on the opposite end of the scale, those you've included a couple of really small pieces that you talked about working with remnants before, showing the frayed edges of the material, which I thought were really delicate.
Yeah, those are like little studies to me. And sometimes I stitch them right on a piece of paper. I mean, they're almost like sketches because, of course I sketch in a sketchbook, but with the working with textiles, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do a sketch with. So those little pieces with the frayed edges of fabric that are small scale, sometimes I stitch them to a piece of paper, but I've also just been experimenting with just pinning them up on the wall themselves.
And finally, I think, not to go too far off course, but I was just curious how, because I'm in a relationship myself with another artist. You're married to Jeffrey, of course, and I was familiar with Jeffrey. We've had a solo show with Jeffrey's work before, and he participated most recently in a group exhibition I put together called Synthetica a couple of years ago. And I've always loved Jeffrey's work and have followed it for many years. I'm just curious in terms of two artists living together, how that works out, and how you guys might perhaps feed off of each other, or...
Yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't be here without him. I mean, he's very supportive of my work. And I think because the fact that he is a painter, an artist, a creative person himself, and knows the importance of, kind of the need to create work. He's always been very supportive of my work and my ideas. And really, I think the fact too that he is an educator, he's a painter, but he's also a professor of painting at the University of Dayton. I think it's that educator in him that pushes me. I think there's that sense of encouragement that comes from being an art educator.
How do your children respond to your artwork? I'm just curious about if that's it, if they have an interest in art, or if it's something because you're doing it, they're not so much interested. I don't know if they haven't reached the teenage years yet, have they?
Yeah, no, we have a 14-year-old son, so he is in 8th grade, and we have a 12-year-old. She'll be 13 in February, so very soon. A daughter. They are both very creative in their own way. When I was working at my studio at home, they were much more closely associated with my work and would come in while I work and, put things up on my design wall and play with fabric a little bit. We certainly don't push art on them at all. They are very creative in their own ways. Our son is a builder. He's very much, I think, a sculptor at heart, or maybe an architect. And our daughter loves to sing and do theaters. It'll be interesting to see what they end up doing.
And then one thing I overlooked in the earlier conversation, I mean, there's a social political aspect of your work, a feminist aspect. I mean, a little bit, the title, The Sense of Place, addresses that a little bit. Perhaps you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I choose to work with fabric now. I mean, back when I started to work and make work, as I was mentioning, when my kids were younger, I sort of worked with fabric out of necessity, sort of at the time, in terms of just having a studio space that was accessible to me with my time limitations and being at home. But now I choose to work with fabric on purpose. To me, just kind of the history that textiles and women, particularly in America, the history that we have with textiles and with women's work is very much conceptually in the forefront of my mind as I work. So, the history of women as quilt makers, the history of women with domestic issues, many times throughout the past in this country, the only type of work that a woman was encouraged to work and create with was a textile-based work, something associated with domesticities. These are conscientious choices that I'm making with, in reference to the past and with reverence to the fact that, this was a woman's place, but now I'm, excited to just keep pushing and seeing what I can do with it.
One of my other favorite things of working in an art gallery and being a director is watch an exhibition transform a space. When you bring, just that transformation that happens from transporting the work from studio, bringing it into a space. And I'm still a bit of a dinosaur in liking the white box, the neutral white box that you can transform by the work you bring into it. And, at the Westin, we have kind of three distinct spaces. And when we do these solo exhibitions, and I love how people can move through the space and make connections to work and historical linkage between the works. And even though your work is very different than Carolyn's, there's a black and white connection, there's social political kind of connection. So, the fun for me is seeing the work take shape in the space. I just hope that day is sooner than later. And I appreciate all the work you've put into creating this work for the show. Looking forward, and gives me hope and optimism as we move into a new year.
Yeah, and thank you for all your work. And I'm really excited to see Carolyn's work and the installation on the upper level too. I'm really looking forward to seeing all of it come together. Whenever that happens, it will happen.
Well, hopefully January. That's what we're going to push for. So
yeah.
And Rebecca, thank you again for facilitating this. I appreciate your assistance, and particularly during this time where I'm kind of dealing with solo operations, so to speak, and this is a great help.
Oh, well, thank you both for allowing me to be part of this. I love the support, and, one of the benefits, if there is one, of these limitations we're living in is creating these sort of virtual experiences that will be legacies of projects as well. So before we go, Heather, I thought maybe you could just do like a little walk with your camera and show off your studio space.
Sure. Figure. There we go. So this is the space. This is where everything is constructed. So I've got sewing machine, piles of fabric, sewing instruments. We've got the iron, and here's the ironing station I was mentioning. And then these windows, which right now the sun is getting really bright in here. But these, giant windows, lots of space on the wall. This is just about the whole show for the Westin. This has got, everything here. This is the design wall, and maybe I can show you how this works. So it's just, flannel stapled to the wall. It just sticks. So this is what I was talking about, how I build these compositions, on this, and it's a pretty big space that I can lay things out. But that's how I, create a lot of the compositions that I work with.
And your studio is in like a factory building that is other artist studios. And can you talk about that?
Yeah. So this is, it's part of the Front Street Gallery building. The front of this space is a project space that Jeff and I run called Divisible. And we are between shows right now because Montgomery County, where we are, is also purple. So there's nothing going on right now. We just took down our last show yesterday. So between shows, Jeff's got some of his work on the wall here. And so this building is a series of artist studios. So there's a number of artist spaces here.
Well, thank you for the tour. Thank you both for the conversation. I look forward to the exhibition in January or whenever it opens. Thank you all for joining us.